My husband said you'll get the spare room. He had no idea the storage unit held $1.06 in assets. Walter told his sister I had been just the bookkeeper while I was standing close enough to hear every word. His sister nodded the way people nod when they are confirming something they already believed. A small, settled nod, the kind that doesn't invite revision. I was, at that moment, holding my keyring. My thumb had found the blue rubber holder out of habit, the way it always did when my hands needed something to do. On that keyring was a brass key, standard cut, nothing distinguished about it, that opened the only padlock on a storage unit across town. That unit, Bay 14C, at a climate-controlled facility on the east side of Albuquerque, contained $1.6 million in cataloged, photographed, appraised, and insured personal property. Every insurance document in the file named me as the insured party. Every storage facility record listed me as the sole registered tenant. The access log for the past 9 years recorded one keycard. Mine. Walter did not have a copy of the key. He had never made one. What he never knew. What he had arranged, actually, without quite realizing the arrangement's full geometry, was that the only thing standing between him and that inventory was a woman he had just described as nothing, holding a key he had forgotten to duplicate. Good day, dear listeners. It's Ren again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that the person whose name is above the door owns the thing. They say that the one who speaks loudest in the room is the one who built it, and that credit follows visibility the way water follows a slope, naturally, inevitably, in the direction everyone can observe. I used to believe some version of that myself. Not loudly, but somewhere underneath my assumptions about how the world assigned value. I held the same quiet understanding most people hold, that you had to be seen to be counted. Then I spent 14 years learning something else entirely. I learned that the most durable form of ownership is the kind no one photographs at the ribbon cutting. It lives in the name on the insurance certificate. It lives in the signature block on the facility registration. It lives in the physical fact of a key on a ring, small, unremarkable, something your thumb finds in the dark before your mind catches up. I am telling you this now because I want you to understand, from the very beginning of this story, that the power was never hidden from Walter. He built it himself. He arranged it, signed off on it, delegated it, and then forgot about it. The way you forget about a tool you've stored so efficiently, you can no longer see it from the door. The day he called me his bookkeeper in front of his sister, he was standing 3 feet from the tool that would cost him 60% of his most valuable inventory. He just didn't know what he was looking at. Most people, dear listeners, never do. Let me take you back to the beginning. To Albuquerque, to the Northeast Heights, to a mid-century split-level house that always smelled faintly of old furniture and lemon polish, a smell I had grown so accustomed to that I only noticed it on the rare occasions I returned from a trip and opened the front door for the first time in several days. The house had good bones and poor flow. Walter had chosen it partly for the dining room, which was large enough to display pieces he was considering for consignment, a carved walnut sideboard, a pair of matched wing chairs, a set of transfer print china arranged on a temporary shelf he'd never quite gotten around to making permanent. I used to joke that we lived in a showroom with a kitchen attached. Walter did not find this especially funny. He found it accurate. I was 48 years old when Walter filed the divorce papers. I had been a certified personal property appraiser for 23 years, 11 before the marriage, 12 spent folding my credentials into the back end of Walter's business in ways that made the business functional and made me, from the outside, invisible. I had earned my certification in 1999. Renewed it every 3 years since without exception, kept current with the professional standards for furniture, silver, decorative arts, and horological items, watches, clocks, the things Walter was particularly drawn to. He had an eye for them, I will say that for him. He could walk into an estate sale at 7 in the morning and spot, across a crowded dining room, the one piece in the house that no one else had correctly identified. That was his gift. Mine was different. Mine was knowing, to within a few percentage points, what that piece would bring at the right auction on the right day, and then documenting it so completely that no one, no insurer, no consignee, no future appraiser, could dispute the value. Walter found the pieces. I told him what they were worth, and then I proved it on paper. We had met at an estate sale in the Rio Rancho foothills, 14 years before the divorce. He was arguing with an auctioneer about the provenance of a Dresden figurine. I happened to know the correct answer. He had looked at me as if I had materialized from somewhere inconvenient, and then he had taken me to coffee and asked whether I was available for consulting work. I was not, at the time, looking for a husband. But Walter, when he wanted something, had the particular social energy of a man who expects doors to open. And for a while, in those early years, I found that quality more appealing than I should have. We married 18 months after we met. I gave up my solo practice to run his back end. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable consolidation of effort. 2 careers with overlapping expertise, 1 shared enterprise. We were going to build something worth building. The split level became our base of operations in the way that a ship's hold becomes a base of operations. You live in it. But the real purpose is the cargo. Sunday mornings, Walter would spread the week's estate sale listings across the kitchen table and mark the ones worth attending. I would sit across from him with my coffee and my reading glasses, the glasses I was constantly moving from my face to the top of my head and back, and I would ask questions. What condition? What period? Was there a maker's mark or only a style reference? He'd describe what he'd seen in the listing photographs, and I would tell him what the range of value might look like if the piece turned out to be what it appeared. It was, in its way, a functional partnership, the kind that looks like a good marriage from a certain angle. The angle matters, of course. It always does. The storage unit came into our lives in the 9th year of the marriage. Walter had been operating out of a rented back room at an antique cooperative on Manal, and the space had become inadequate. The inventory had grown, the pieces were larger, more valuable, more environmentally sensitive. A climate-controlled unit was the logical answer. His accountant at the time, a careful, methodical man named Gerald Fuentes, who I had always liked, recommended registering the unit in my name individually rather than in the operating business entity. The logic was standard, keeping personal property claims from attaching to the LLC if a consignment dispute ever arose. Gerald explained this at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, with the kind of patience that suggested he'd explained it several times to business clients before. Walter had nodded, signed the authorization form Gerald had prepared, and handed the paperwork to me. I opened the facility account the following Tuesday. I signed the rental agreement. I signed the insurance application. The insurance carrier issued the certificate, naming me, Rosalie Dunbar, as the insured party for all personal property held at Bay 14C. The facility gave me 2 keys. I kept both initially, and then, when Walter asked for one to take to a sale without me, I gave him one. A year later, he lost it. He mentioned it in passing, the way you mention a pen cap, and said he'd meant to ask for a replacement. He never did. I had not thought of it as significant. At the time, it wasn't. What it became, over 9 years of acquisitions, cataloging, condition reports, photography sessions, insurance renewals, and 5 volumes of 3 ring binders filled with my handwriting, was something Gerald had not quite anticipated when he drew up the arrangement. But I'll come to that. The key lived on my main ring. Brass, cut to standard, in a blue rubber holder that had faded slightly from the original cobalt to something closer to the color of worn denim. I touched it the way you touch something you carry out of habit, without looking at it, without thinking about what it opens. It was simply there, part of the weight of my keys, part of my day. I want to tell you about the first time I noticed the warning, not the key. The thing that came before I understood what the key would mean. It was spring, the spring before Walter filed, though I didn't know that at the time. The cottonwoods along the North Diversion Channel were releasing their fluff in the particular way they do in late April, filling the air with something that looks like snow and settles like guilt. Walter had started attending estate sales with a business partner I had not met. He mentioned him once, briefly, a man named Glenn, who ran a competing estate resale operation out of Rio Rancho. Walter said they'd found a complementary overlap in specialties. Glenn focused on furniture, Walter focused on smaller decorative items and watches. A natural division, Walter said, that made both operations more efficient. I had asked, in the way I asked about acquisitions, whether Glenn was someone I should be in contact with for documentation purposes. Walter said it wasn't necessary yet. He'd let me know when it became relevant. He did not let me know. Sunday mornings, the estate sale listings stayed in his phone rather than spreading across the kitchen table. The table got quiet. The coffee got quieter. I noticed, the way you notice when a familiar sound stops, not with alarm, but with a mild cellular awareness that something in the background has changed. I did not press. I am not, by nature, a presser. What I am, by training and by temperament, is an observer of what things actually are, beneath what they are presented to be. And what Walter's new arrangement actually was, I began to understand at some low preparatory register that my conscious mind had not yet caught up with. I filed it. I kept working. I prepared the insurance renewal schedule for the storage unit, Bay 14C, $1. $6 million in appraised contents, my name in every field that mattered, and I sent it to the insurer from my personal email, the way I always had. The second sign came through the mail. Or rather, through email, Walter's email. The insurance carrier sent the annual renewal notice to Walter's address for the first time in 9 years. A small redirect, the kind of thing that happens when someone, somewhere in an administrative process, updates a preferred contact without fully understanding the implications of the existing documentation. The renewal notice landed in Walter's inbox. He forwarded it to me without comment, just the forwarded email, no covering note, the way you forward something you consider clerical. I looked at it for a moment. Then I called the insurance carrier directly. I confirmed my status as named insured. I updated the preferred contact to my personal email address. The representative on the phone asked whether I wanted to make any other changes to the policy. I said no. I thanked her. I hung up. I did not mention the call to Walter. There was nothing to mention, technically. I had simply corrected my own contact information on my own insurance policy. That was all. But I sat with the forwarded email for a little while after the call, and I thought about Gerald's careful explanation at the kitchen table, 9 years earlier, about what registrant meant, about what named insured meant, about the difference between a formality and a legal instrument. Then I put my glasses back on and finished the afternoon's condition reports. Walter told me he was filing for divorce on a Tuesday. It was early afternoon. The light in the kitchen had that flat, white, late October quality that makes everything look slightly overexposed. He was standing in the doorway. I was at the table with a binder open, cross-referencing an acquisition record with the insurance schedule. He said his attorney had advised him that the process would be cleaner if initiated formally rather than through mediation. He said it the way you say something you have rehearsed past the point of feeling it. I looked up at him. I looked back at the binder. I said, "All right." He nodded. He left the room. That was the whole conversation. That evening, his sister Priscilla came to the house. Priscilla had always approached me with the particular courtesy of someone who has decided in advance that you are not quite in the room. She was polite in the way that keeps you at arm's length. She asked Walter in the hallway how the business would be divided, and Walter said, loudly, clearly, in a voice that was accustomed to carrying across auction floors, she was just the bookkeeper. She has nothing. I was in the kitchen. The coffee cup was in my hand. I set it down on the counter with a care I did not entirely explain to myself in that moment, a deliberate, considered placement, the cup exactly parallel to the edge of the counter. I looked at my keyring, lying next to the dish rack where I always left it. I picked it up. My thumb found the blue rubber holder without looking. I put the keyring in my pocket. I did not go into the hallway. I did not raise my voice. I stood in the kitchen with the key in my pocket and the binder on the table, and the sound of Walter explaining my limitations to his sister, and something in my chest went very still and very clear. Not anger, not grief, but the specific clarity of a person who reaches for something in the dark and finds, with surprise that it is exactly where they left it. The next morning, I called Cecily Thorne. The initial consultation lasted 2 hours. Cecily's office was on the second floor of a building near Old Town, with southwest-facing windows that filled the afternoon with a warm, diffused light. She was 46, efficient, and direct in the way of someone who has spent 20 years in family law and has learned that the clearest path between 2 points is honesty delivered without apology. She asked me to walk her through the business structure and the asset picture. I did. When I reached the storage unit, I placed the insurance rider on the table. 22 pages, single-spaced, every item cataloged with acquisition date, condition notes, appraised value, and total insured value, $1.6 million. Named insured, Rosalie Dunbar. Cecily read the first page. She turned to the second. She read for a while. Then she asked me to describe the registration arrangement. I described it. She asked about the key. I took the keyring from my bag and set it on the table. She looked at it for a moment, the blue rubber holder, the brass key, nothing dramatic about it, and then she said, "Is there a copy?" I said, "No." She nodded once. She wrote something in her notebook. She said, "I'd like to see the facility's access records." I said I would provide them. I had already pulled them. When I left the consultation, I drove east. I drove to the storage facility on the commercial strip past Tramway, turned into the lot, pulled up to Bay 14C. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. The afternoon was cooling fast, the way Albuquerque afternoons do in October, the light turning from white to gold to something thin and final. I got out. I unlocked the padlock. The door rolled up with its familiar sound, the light inside clicking on automatically, the smell coming forward immediately, cool air, old wood, a faint chemical note from the acid-free materials in the flat files. I stood in the doorway. The 5 catalog binders were in the wire rack to the right of the entrance, where I had always kept them. Behind them, along the left wall, the shelving units, organized by category, silver to the back, watches in the locked case on the second shelf, decorative ceramics on the top. Along the right wall, large furniture wrapped in moving blankets. Each piece tagged with a condition report folder tucked into a plastic sleeve taped to the blanket. In the center of the back wall, the flat files, 3 of them, stacked, where the framed artwork lay horizontal and protected. I knew where everything was, without the catalog. I had put everything there. I had documented everything there. I had renewed the insurance on everything there every year for 9 years under my name. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt, standing in the cool air of Bay 14C with the door open behind me and the afternoon light falling just past the threshold, was something closer to a quiet, factual sorrow. The kind that comes not from what you are about to do, but from what it has already cost you to arrive at this point. 14 years. A house that smelled like lemon polish and old furniture. Sunday mornings at the kitchen table with the sale listings between us. The version of the partnership I had believed in for a while before the kitchen table went quiet. I let myself feel that for a moment. Just a moment. Then I turned off the light, pulled the door down, clicked the padlock shut, and drove home. I had one certainty that nothing in the world was going to alter. Walter had never made a copy of that key. The second consultation with Cecily was the one where the architecture of the position became fully clear. I brought the facility registration agreement, the original insurance application bearing my signature, the access log for 9 years showing my keycard as the only credential ever issued for Bay 14C, and the 5 catalog binders, 1 per year, each containing condition reports, photographs, and appraisal certificates for every acquisition, every note in my handwriting. Every certification bearing my professional credentials as the documenting appraiser. I stacked them on the conference table. They made a substantial pile. Cecily looked at the pile for a moment. Then she read the registration agreement. Then she read the access log summary. Then she placed her hands flat on the table and said, "This is an extraordinary position." I said, "I know." She said, "The question will be whether the transfer of registration was substantive or administrative. And the answer to that question is in these binders." She tapped the stack with one finger. Your handwriting, your appraisal credentials, your professional judgment attached to every item in that unit. That's not administration, Rosalie. That's ownership of a professional function. Under New Mexico law, there is a very serious argument that this was a substantive transfer. I nodded. I had thought so too. I had thought so for about 48 hours, from the moment I set the coffee cup down on the counter. Cecily sent the demand letter to Walter's attorney on a Wednesday. It was a Wednesday in early November, dry and bright. The Sandia Mountains carrying their late-season pink in the late afternoon light. I know the day because I remember where I was when Cecily called to confirm it had been transmitted. I was at the kitchen table, alone now in the house, in the way that a familiar space becomes unfamiliar when the person you shared it with is gone. Going through a box of old acquisition receipts I had been meaning to file for months. The receipts were in Walter's handwriting. Most of them were wrong, not dishonestly wrong, but imprecisely wrong, the way a person with a good eye and poor paperwork habits records things. He had written Tiffany sterling on a receipt for a piece that was, in fact, Sheffield plate. He had written circa 1920 on a receipt for a piece that a careful examination of the maker's mark would have placed closer to 1935. I had corrected these things, in my own records, 9 years of times. Walter had relied on my corrections without always knowing that was what he was relying on. I thought about that, sitting with his imprecise receipts. And then I put the box aside and answered Cecily's call. Walter's attorney, a man named Philip Stearns, whom I had never met but had heard Walter mention as thorough and expensive, called Cecily back on the Friday of that same week. He asked whether we were seriously pursuing the storage unit contents as a marital asset claim. Cecily told me later that she had paused before answering, not from hesitation, but from the particular deliberate patience of a litigator who wants her response to land with full weight. She said, yes. Stearns asked for the insurance rider and the complete property schedule. Cecily said we would provide them and did so by end of business that day. 22 pages of itemized, appraised, insured personal property. Named insured, Rosalie Dunbar. Total, $1.6 million. 2 days after providing the documents, my phone rang. It was not Walter's attorney. It was Priscilla. She had never called me on my cell phone. We had always communicated through Walter or in person, with the arm's length courtesy she applied to most of our interactions. But it was her number, and it was her voice, and the voice had changed in some quality I could not immediately name. She said, Rosalie, is it true about the storage? I said, you should ask Walter. There was a pause. She said, I'm asking you. Another pause. Mine, this time. Then, I said, everything is in Cecily's hands. Priscilla was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I didn't know it was in your name. I said, I know you didn't. I thanked her for calling. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, thinking about what it meant that Priscilla, who had nodded in that settled, confirming way when Walter said I had nothing, had called me privately, not to ask whether it was legal, to ask whether it was true. That was a different question. That was the question of someone who had already begun to understand that the summary she had accepted was incomplete. Walter's attorney made his first formal counter-argument 2 weeks after the demand letter. The argument was that the registration of the storage unit in my name had been an administrative act, a liability management tool, not a substantive transfer of ownership or property rights. He submitted a brief laying out the position. The assets had been acquired by the business, using business funds, for business purposes, and the registration was a technicality of no legal significance to the marital estate. Cecily read the brief. She called me. She said, this is a reasonable argument. It has one problem. I asked what the problem was. She said, it ignores the professional services element. In New Mexico, personal property that has been documented, insured, and managed by an individual under their professional credentials they hold and maintain independently of the business, is not purely a business asset. The question is, who was the custodian of record? And whether that custodianship was merely clerical or substantively professional. And we have 5 binders that answer that question in detail. The binders became, in the weeks that followed, the center of the evidentiary dispute. Stearns argued that my entries were the records of an employee performing administrative functions. Cecily produced the condition reports, not administrative checklists, but professional appraisal documents, each one citing comparable sales data, noting departures from standard condition, applying the methodology I had been trained to apply and had been licensed to apply since 1999. She produced the appraisal certificates I had signed, under my professional certification number, for the insurance carrier's annual valuation updates. She produced the written communications between me and the insurer, 9 years of them, in which I had acted not as a representative of the business, but as Rosalie Dunbar, named insured, managing a policy under my own authority. Stearns reviewed the material and requested a 2-week extension to file a supplemental counterbrief. Cecily granted it. During those 2 weeks, something else happened. Marco Dunbar, Walter's adult son from his first marriage, a civil engineer in his mid-30s who had always been pleasant to me without being particularly close, ran into Cecily's paralegal in the hallway outside the conference suite on a day he had come to meet with his father's legal team. The paralegal was carrying the binder stack. Marco looked at the binders. He said, Is the storage thing real? I mean, is it actually in her name?" The paralegal said she couldn't comment on the proceedings. Marco nodded. He looked at the binders for another moment. He said, 14 years, she kept those. Then he walked away. I heard about this from Cecily, who had heard it from her paralegal, who had found it worth noting. I found it worth noting, too, not because Marco's surprise changed anything, but because it confirmed something I already knew. The people around Walter had accepted the summary he had offered them. Nobody had checked the documents. Nobody had needed to, until now. Because, until now, I had never asked anyone to look at what was actually in my name. Stern's supplemental brief arrived on a Thursday. It was more detailed than the first. It cited 3 cases in which New Mexico courts had characterized liability management registrations as administrative acts with no bearing on marital property characterization. Cecily read them overnight. She called me the next morning. She said, "These are real cases." She also said, "None of them involve professional appraisal credentials attached to the documentation. None of them involve an access log showing the named registrant as the sole entry point over 9 years. None of them involve a situation where the registrant was, simultaneously, the licensed professional whose work product determines the value of the asset." She paused. "I want to go to the property valuation hearing. I want the binders in front of the commissioner." I said, "Do what you think is right." She said, "I think this is right." In the 2 weeks between Cecily's decision and the hearing date, something else occurred that I only learned about later, from Cecily, who had it from a contact at the insurance carrier. Walter had contacted the insurer directly, not through Stearns, not formally, but by calling the policy services line and asking whether the named insured designation on the Bay 14C policy could be updated. The representative had asked him to provide his name. He gave it. The representative had confirmed that his name did not appear on the policy as insured party, co-insured party, or authorized representative. She had informed him that changes to the named insured designation required a signed request from the current named insured, Rosalie Dunbar, along with supporting documentation. Walter had said that he was the policy owner. The representative had explained, with the particular patient clarity of someone who has delivered this information before, that the named insured on a personal property policy is the legal party holding the insurable interest, and that designation does not change based on the intentions of a third party. Walter had ended the call. The insurer had noted the inquiry in the account log. Cecily received the account log as part of our document production. She did not lead with it in the hearing. She kept it in reserve. That is the kind of attorney Cecily is. She knows which documents to use first and which to hold until the moment they will be most clearly understood. I did not tell Walter that I knew about the call. There was no useful reason to tell him. The call was already in the record. The record was already in Cecily's file. What I thought about, when I learned of it, was the particular quality of his misunderstanding, that he had believed, even at that late stage, that the name on the policy was something that could be adjusted by intention, by assertion, by the confidence of a man who has spent his professional life being the one whose name is above the door. He had not understood, until that representative explained it to him, that the instrument does not care about your intentions. It cares about the name, and the name had been mine for 9 years. The night before the property valuation hearing, I sat at the kitchen table in the Northeast Heights house and went through the binders one final time. Not because I needed to. I had prepared those documents. I had organized each tabbed section, written each condition note, signed each appraisal certificate. I knew what was in them the way a musician knows a score before a performance, not by remembering it, but by having internalized it. I went through them anyway, because careful attention was, for me, its own form of argument, more reliable than confidence. The key was on the table beside me. I had placed it there without thinking, the way you set down whatever is in your hand when you sit. The blue rubber holder caught the lamplight. I looked at it while I read. I thought about the first time I had driven to the facility with that key, 9 years earlier. A bright spring morning, the cottonwoods just coming into leaf. I had walked every bay before choosing the unit. I had asked the facility manager about the humidity controls, the fire suppression system, the security protocols. He had answered with the careful detail of a man who understands that people asking careful questions are the people who will actually use what he is offering. I had signed the agreement. I had paid the first month's deposit. I had driven home with 2 keys on my ring and told Walter the unit was ready. He had said, "Good." He had been reading the listings. I closed the last binder at 11 o'clock, stacked all 5 in order with binder clips marking the relevant sections. I picked up the key. I held it for a moment, just as an object, a thing with weight and a specific purpose. Then I put it in my bag with the binders and went to bed. I slept without difficulty. I have always been able to sleep when I have done the work correctly. The property valuation hearing was held in a county administrative building on a Tuesday morning in late November. The room was plain, long table, fluorescent overheads, the kind of institutional neutrality that makes everyone look equally uncomfortable. I brought the binders. Cecily presented the insurance documents, the registration agreement, the access log, and the catalog. Every item, every photograph, every condition note, every appraisal certification. The family law commissioner was a woman in her late 50s with the expression of someone who has spent decades distinguishing between what people say they own and what they can prove they own. She asked several specific questions about the appraisal methodology. I answered them. She asked whether my professional certification was currently active. I confirmed that it was, maintained current since 1999, most recent renewal completed 8 months earlier. She noted this in the record. The hearing lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, the commissioner indicated that she would provide her property characterization recommendation to the court within 30 days. She also indicated, without elaboration, that the documentation presented was unusually comprehensive. Stearns contacted Cecily the following Monday and asked whether we were open to a settlement conference. Cecily said we would make ourselves available. The conference was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in October. The following October. The one that arrives after the legal machinery has run its course and the positions have been tested and the counter-arguments have exhausted their reasonable range. A year, nearly, from the Tuesday Walter had stood in the kitchen doorway and told me the process would be cleaner if initiated formally. A year is a long time to live with a question whose answer you already know. But I had been patient for 14 years. I could be patient for 1 more. The month before the conference, Walter tried one more thing. He contacted me directly, not through Stearns, not through Cecily, but through a text message to my personal number. It said, "Rosalie, I think we can resolve this if you're reasonable. I'm willing to give you the house equity. You don't need the unit." I showed it to Cecily. She advised me not to respond. I did not respond. The house equity, our equity in the Northeast Heights split level, was $187,000. Roughly, the storage unit contents were $1.6 million. The arithmetic of Walter's definition of reasonable was, I thought, clarifying. I spent the weeks before the conference doing something I had not done in several months. I went back to appraising. Not for Walter's business, that connection had been suspended since the filing, but for a former client who had reached out about an estate in the Nob Hill neighborhood, a house full of mid-century Scandinavian furniture and a collection of Pueblo pottery that needed proper documentation before a family could divide the estate. I drove to Nob Hill on a bright November morning, set my bag down in the living room, put my glasses on, and started at the beginning. Condition, provenance, comparable sales, estimated value range. I had done this work for 23 years. It had not changed. The objects told you what they were, if you knew what to look for. You just had to be willing to look carefully, without letting what you hoped for interfere with what you actually found. By the end of the second day, I had a preliminary estimate on 14 pieces. The client was pleased. I drove home with my glasses on top of my head and the keyring in my hand, and the particular, quiet satisfaction of a person who has done something difficult well. The Thursday of the settlement conference arrived the way important days tend to arrive, looking exactly like every other day, with the same October light and the same dry Albuquerque air and the same drive across the city that I had made 1,000 times. Cecily's office. The second-floor conference room with the southwest-facing windows. The afternoon light warm on the table. I arrived 15 minutes before Walter. I sat down. I put my bag on the chair beside me. I put my keyring on the table. Not as a gesture, not as a performance, just because it was in my hand and I set it down. The blue rubber holder, the brass key, 14 years of inventory, $1.6 million, 9 years of the only padlock key, sitting on a conference table in the afternoon light. Walter arrived with Stearns. He came through the door with the particular forward momentum of a man who expects the room to receive him. And then he registered that I was already sitting, and something in that momentum shifted almost imperceptibly. He did not look at me directly. He took the seat across the table and arranged his legal pad and his reading glasses with the focused attention of a person who needs something to do with his hands. Stearns sat beside him and set out his documents. Cecily sat beside me and set out hers. The room settled. Cecily opened by placing 3 items in the center of the table: the insurance rider, the storage facility registration agreement, and the spare key. The key sat in its blue rubber holder on the conference table, between the documents, small and unremarkable and absolute. Stearns looked at it. He picked up the insurance rider and turned to the named insured page. He read it. He set the rider down. He picked up the registration agreement. He found the registrant designation. He read it. He set it down. He leaned to Walter and said, quietly, though not quietly enough, "Did you know she was listed as named insured?" Walter said he had transferred it for tax purposes. Stearns said, at a volume that was not quite quiet, "That is not in New Mexico law what an administrative act is." Walter said, "Gerald said it was a liability thing." Stearns said, "Gerald was right about the purpose. The effect is a different question." There was a pause. Then, Walter picked up the key. He held it the way you hold something you're trying to understand by touch. He turned it over. Brass, standard cut, blue rubber holder worn to the color of old denim. He had given it to me 9 years ago. He had never made a copy. He had never needed to. He had access through me, whenever he needed it, and the paperwork had seemed like formality, the kind of thing that happened in the background while the real business happened in the foreground. He turned the key over once more. Then he set it back on the table. He set it down carefully, the way I had set down the coffee cup in the kitchen a year earlier, with a precision that comes from not trusting your hands to do anything casual. He looked at Stearns. Stearns was reviewing the access log. 9 years, 1 keycard, 1 registered name. Stearns said, "I think we need to discuss our position." Walter looked at me. It was the first time in the several hours we had been in each other's proximity that he had looked at me directly. His face had the specific quality of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of a room he thought he knew. Then he looked away. He looked away first. And I understood in that moment that the conference was going to end the way it was going to end. It took 3 more hours. There were numbers on legal pads and proposals passed across the table, and one recess during which Cecily and I stood in the hallway with our coffee cups, and she said, "Quietly, he's buying." I said, "I know." She said, "The question is how much." I said, "The question is whether he understands what the question is." She smiled, the brief, dry smile of a person who has spent 20 years in conference rooms. 3 hours after Walter picked up the key and set it back down, the settlement agreement was initialed by all parties. 60% of the appraised value of the storage unit contents, $960,000 in cataloged personal property or its cash equivalent. The marital home equity, $187,000. A cash equalization payment, $74,000. Total, to Rosalie Dunbar, approximately $1.22 million. Walter retained the operating entity, the LC, the business name, the goodwill he had spent 14 years building. He was permitted to purchase specific items from the settlement inventory at their appraised value. He purchased 3, a pair of Victorian bracket clocks he had always been particularly attached to, and a small oil painting that had hung on the hallway wall of the split level for so long that I think he had stopped seeing it as inventory and started seeing it as home. He paid fair value for all 3. I checked the appraisals myself. The day after the settlement was signed, I drove east across the city in the early morning light, that specific Albuquerque gold that comes low from behind the Sandias before it flattens into midday white, and pulled into the storage facility for the last time while Bay 14C still held everything. I wanted to see it full before the auction house came, before the collectors arrived, before the 3 pieces Walter had agreed to purchase at appraised value were removed, and the rest dispersed into the world. I unlocked the padlock. The door rolled up. The cool air moved forward with its familiar smell, old wood, acid-free storage materials, the faint mineral sharpness of the silver. Everything was precisely as I had left it on my last working visit. The wrapped furniture along the right wall, each piece tagged in its plastic sleeve. The flat files against the back. The locked case on the middle shelf where the watches lay on their individual cushions. The 5 binders in the wire rack by the door. I walked the length of the unit without touching anything. The Duncan Fife card table, whose inlay I had reappraised upward after examining it in person, from 40,200 to 50,800, a correction documented in full in the Year 3 binder. The arts and crafts wall sconces in their original verdigris finish, whose condition report had required the most careful, comparable sales reasoning I had done in years. The flat file where the small Taos School oil painting lay in its glassine and board, the one Walter would choose to buy back. I understood why. There are pieces you stop seeing as inventory. I had stopped seeing that painting as inventory too, somewhere in the 9 years, and the difference between us was only that I never confused what I felt about a thing with what I could prove it was worth. I turned off the light. The padlock clicked shut. I stood in the parking lot in the thin morning air, the key in my hand, the mountains pale at the east end of the city. Then I put the key back on my ring and drove home. The unit was cleared by the 31st of October. Some pieces went to auction, a regional house in Santa Fe that specialized in estate sales and consignment, which was a kind of circularity I noticed and did not comment on. Some pieces were purchased directly by collectors whose contact information was in the catalog binders. The settlement's cash equivalent arrived in 2 tranches, as agreed. Walter's business restructured. The high-value inventory that had made the consignment operation viable was now subject to a division that left him with a significantly reduced working stock. I heard, through the particular informal network that exists in the Albuquerque estate sale world, that he had brought Glenn, the Rio Rancho partner he had begun working with in the spring, into a more formal arrangement. I wished him whatever came from that. I genuinely did. I had not stopped wishing Walter well simply because he had misjudged what I held. In November, I went back to part-time appraisal work. Full-time felt like more than I wanted, not because I lacked the capacity, but because I had spent 14 years doing someone else's back end, and I found, when the structure was gone, that I wanted to move at my own pace for a while. The Nob Hill estate was the first assignment. After that, a referral from a decorator in the University District who needed an opinion on a collection of New Mexican landscape paintings, a consignment opportunity, not a sale, and the opinion mattered. After that, a private collector in Corrales who had inherited a house full of Japanese export porcelain and didn't know where to start. Each job was its own small world of objects and history, and the work of determining value with precision. I had missed this. I had missed being the one whose judgment was the product, rather than the supporting infrastructure for someone else's judgment. The split level sold in December. I had bought out Walter's share of the equity as part of the settlement, which meant the house was mine to keep or mine to sell, and I sold it. I was not sentimental about it in the way I might have expected to be. The house had been a staging area more than a home, and I had spent enough of my life in staging areas. I found an apartment in the Nob Hill neighborhood, on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian, with high ceilings and south-facing windows and a small study where I set up my desk and my reference library, and the 5 catalog binders in a row on the shelf above my monitor. The binders are there now. I look at them every day when I sit down to work. They are not trophies. They are records. The distinction matters to me. The key is still on my keyring. It does not open anything now. The padlock was removed from Bay 14C when the unit was cleared, and the facility deregistered the account. And the blue rubber holder now hangs from my main ring alongside the apartment key and the car key and the key to my parents' house in the East Mountains that I've carried for 30 years. I have not removed it. I keep it because it is small and ordinary, and because it is, in its way, the most accurate object I own. It does not announce itself. It does not explain itself. It is simply a key that opens a thing, or opened a thing, for 9 years, until the thing it opened became the foundation of everything that came after. Priscilla called me in January, not about the settlement, which was concluded, and not about Walter, who was her business now, and not mine. She called because she had been going through some inherited pieces from her mother's house, ceramics mostly, and a few pieces of silver, and she wondered whether I would be willing to take a look at them, give her a professional opinion. I said yes. We met at a coffee shop in the Old Town neighborhood, near the building where Cecily's office was, and I brought my reference materials and my reading glasses and my keyring with the spare key still on it. We spent 2 hours on the photographs she had brought. 4 of the ceramics were significant. 1 piece of silver was more significant than she'd realized. I told her what everything was worth. She listened carefully. She took notes. At the end of it, she said, "You're very good at this." I said, "I know." She looked at me. Not the arm's length courtesy. Something else, something slightly uncomfortable. The look of a person who is revising a summary they have held for a long time and finding the revision overdue. I didn't press it. I put my glasses on top of my head and thanked her for the coffee and drove home in the thin winter light. Walter spent 14 years believing that the person who documents a thing does not own it, that the name on the insurance policy is a formality, and the name above the door is the truth. He was wrong in a way that cost him 60% of the inventory he had spent those same 14 years acquiring. I do not say this with satisfaction. I say it because it is the most accurate description of what happened, and accuracy has always been my professional commitment. The most durable form of ownership is the quiet kind, the name on the form that no one checks because they assume it says what they expect. The key on the ring that no one duplicates because they assume they can always get one when they need it. If you had been standing in that storage unit, dear listeners, if you had looked at the binders, at the flat files, at the wrapped furniture along the walls, and then felt the key in your pocket and understood that yours was the only one in the world, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. And if you know someone who does the work behind the scenes, who keeps the records while someone else takes the credit, share this with them. They might need to hear it. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.